The roar of propellers ripped across the Mediterranean sky as dawn light glimmered over the sea. The year was 1943, and Italy's air force was crumbling under the relentless pressure of Allied might. For Italian pilots, the war had become a desperate struggle of survival, each mission more dangerous than the last. They were brave, they were determined, but they were flying machines already considered outdated compared to the new Allied aircraft that seemed to evolve with every passing month. On this particular morning, the squadron stationed near Sicily prepared to launch. Their Macchi C.202 fighters stood ready, slender and elegant with their camouflaged green paint. To the Italians, the Macchi was still a source of pride, a nimble dogfighter, responsive and graceful in the air. But in truth, even the pilots knew it was losing its edge against the advanced designs coming out of American and British factories. The mission was supposed to be simple: intercept a formation of Allied bombers reported over the coast. Yet as the Italian pilots strapped themselves into their cockpits, a sense of unease settled in. Intelligence reports spoke of new American planes appearing in the theater. Aircraft so fast, so heavily armed, that even the most seasoned Axis pilots struggled against them. Engines roared to life, and soon the squadron took off, climbing into the golden Mediterranean sky. The leader scanned the horizon, eyes sharp, searching for the familiar silhouettes of bombers or escort fighters. But what they saw that day was something none of them had expected. Dark shapes appeared in the distance, flying low and fast, their wings bent like the talons of some great bird of prey. At first, the Italians thought they might be American Hellcats or perhaps even British Spitfires, planes they had faced before. But as the mysterious aircraft drew closer, the reality became chillingly clear. These were unlike anything they had seen. The gull-like wings glistened in the sun, curving downward before snapping up toward the tips. Their engines roared with a ferocity that shook the very air. These were F4U Corsairs, the newest American naval fighters, recently unleashed into the European and Mediterranean skies. To the Italians, it felt as if the future of aerial combat had suddenly descended upon them. The Corsair was a monster by comparison. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine churned out over 2,000 horsepower, driving the plane to speeds the Italian fighters could hardly dream of. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns lined its wings, capable of shredding any opponent in a single burst. And perhaps most terrifying of all was the way it moved, swift, brutal, and utterly unrelenting. As the formations closed in, the Italians tightened their grips on the controls. The squadron leader barked through the radio, "Attenti! Nemici sconosciuti!" Warning unknown enemies. Moments later, the sky erupted. Tracers sliced through the air as the Corsairs dove into the Italian formation. The first burst tore through the tail of a Macchi, flames spewing from the engine as the pilot bailed out desperately. Another Corsair climbed almost vertically, turning impossibly fast for such a heavy machine, before rolling and diving back down on its prey. The Italians tried to respond. They broke formation, twisting and turning, attempting to use the Macchi's agility to outmaneuver the attackers. For a brief moment, one Italian managed to slip behind a Corsair, squeezing the trigger as bullets stitched across the American's fuselage. But the Corsair shrugged off the damage, its thick armor absorbing the punishment, and with a sudden roll it flipped behind the Italian fighter, firing a devastating burst that ended the duel in seconds. From the ground below, soldiers and civilians alike looked up at the spectacle. What they saw was not a battle of equals, but a massacre in the making. The Corsairs cut through the Italian formation like predators tearing into fragile prey. Where once the Italians had been hunters of the Mediterranean skies, now they were hunted. One pilot, young and inexperienced, felt sheer terror as a Corsair locked onto his tail. He pulled every maneuver he knew, diving, rolling, dragging his machine to its limits. But the Corsair stuck to him, relentless, like a hawk chasing a dove. A stream of .50 caliber fire ripped across his fuselage, and his plane spiraled downward, smoke trailing behind as he screamed into the radio. For those who survived the initial clash, the realization was immediate. This was not like fighting the Spitfires or Hurricanes of the RAF, where skill and maneuver could sometimes level the field. The Corsair was a machine designed to dominate, to destroy quickly and decisively. No amount of courage could change the raw imbalance of power. By the end of the encounter, the Italian squadron was broken. Those who escaped returned to base in shock. their eyes wide with disbelief. They had not simply been defeated. They had been humbled, crushed by an enemy that seemed more like a beast of iron and fire than a conventional fighter plane. Whispers spread among the pilots that evening. Some claimed the Corsairs were invincible, that no human skill could stand against them. Others sat silently, haunted by the images of burning aircraft and the screams of friends echoing through the radio. The war in the air had changed forever, and the Italians knew they had just glimpsed a terrifying new future. For the Americans, this was just the beginning. For the Italians, it was the day hope in the skies began to vanish. The sun dipped lower over the Mediterranean horizon, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold. At the Italian airfields, the surviving pilots staggered back, their uniforms stained with sweat, their faces pale with shock. Mechanics and ground crew rushed toward the returning aircraft, expecting tales of victory. But what greeted them instead were shattered men, their words trembling as they spoke of a machine that seemed more demon than airplane. Their wings, one pilot muttered, his eyes unfocused, curved, like a bird of prey. They dive faster than anything I've ever seen. And the firepower. Dio mio, the firepower! He collapsed onto the ground, his body shaking. Officers tried to restore order, but whispers spread like wildfire across the base. The Americans had unleashed a new fighter, a monster of steel and fury. And the Italians had no answer. High command dismissed these stories at first. Reports of invincible enemy planes had circulated before, often exaggerated by fear or exhaustion. But within days, the rumors became undeniable. Squadrons across the Mediterranean reported similar encounters. Each time, Italian formations were ripped apart with terrifying speed. Each time, the mysterious gull-winged fighters left trails of burning wreckage behind them. The Macchi C.202s and the newer C.205 Veltros tried to hold the line. On paper, they were respectable machines, fast, agile, and armed with 12.7mm machine guns and, in some cases, cannons. In the hands of skilled pilots, they could still challenge Spitfires, Hurricanes, even the formidable P-38 Lightning. But against the Corsair, they found themselves utterly outclassed. In one clash near Sardinia, a squadron of Italian fighters spotted a lone Corsair flying low over the sea. Thinking it vulnerable, they dove in, eager for an easy kill. But within minutes, the tables turned. The Corsair's pilot rolled, climbed, and unleashed devastating bursts, downing 2 Italians before the rest even realized what had happened. Witnesses described it as watching a wolf tear through sheep. The survivors fled, humiliated, their pride shattered. The Corsair's design gave it brutal advantages. Its massive radial engine granted it unmatched acceleration in dives, allowing it to swoop down from above like a hawk. Its gull-shaped wings weren't just for appearance. They reduced drag and allowed for a massive propeller that translated raw horsepower into terrifying speed. And when it came to firepower, the 6 Browning machine guns could pour out hundreds of rounds in seconds, enough to dismember even the toughest Axis planes. For the Italians, the psychological toll became unbearable. Veteran pilots who had once flown with confidence now hesitated before missions. The younger recruits, barely trained, often froze at the first sight of those bent wings cutting across the sky. One Italian ace, renowned for his daring maneuvers, recounted a chilling encounter. He had managed to evade 3 Corsairs for nearly 10 minutes, twisting and turning through the clouds, relying on instinct and experience. But eventually, the Americans adapted, trapping him in a pincer. With fuel running low and sweat dripping into his eyes, he realized there was no escape. In his final radio transmission, he whispered, "È finita." It is over. Moments later, his aircraft plunged into the sea, swallowed by the waves. On the ground, propaganda officers struggled to spin the story. They claimed the Americans had brought experimental planes, fragile prototypes unfit for mass production. But the truth was undeniable. The Corsair was entering the war in force, and it was only the beginning. Symbol of dominance. They nicknamed it the Enforcer of the Skies, and stories of its victories spread rapidly through Allied squadrons. For many American pilots, their first combat experiences were against Italian fighters, and the results gave them a dangerous sense of invincibility. But for the Italians, each encounter became a nightmare etched into memory. In one particularly brutal engagement, a squadron of Corsairs intercepted Italian bombers heading to strike Allied ships. Before the bombers could even release their payloads, the Corsairs tore through their escorts, then dove onto the bombers themselves. Witnesses from the ground said it looked like lightning tearing through clouds, sudden, violent, and unstoppable. Only a handful of the Italians limped home. That night, around the flickering lanterns of the mess hall, the surviving pilots sat in silence. The usual banter, the laughter, the proud retelling of dogfights, all were gone. Instead, men stared into their cups, haunted by images of black smoke trails and burning wings. Some clenched their fists, swearing vengeance. Others quietly admitted what no one wanted to say aloud. The war in the skies was lost. One young pilot finally broke the silence. "If these Corsairs spread across Europe," he said, voice trembling, "then we are finished. No strategy, no bravery, nothing will matter." His words hung heavy in the air, unchallenged, because deep down, they all knew he was right. The Corsair had not only destroyed their planes, it had destroyed their spirit, and as the Allies prepared for greater offensives, Italy itself on the brink of invasion, the Corsair loomed like an omen. The gull-winged predator, forged in American factories, was now rewriting the balance of power in the skies. But the nightmare was far from over. For the Italians, the next battles would not just test their machines or their skills. They would test their very will to fight against an enemy that seemed born to dominate the air. The summer of 1943 brought with it a storm that Italy could no longer hold back. The Allied landings in Sicily marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini's empire. On the ground, soldiers braced for invasion. At sea, convoys of warships thundered forward. And in the skies above, the Corsair became the harbinger of doom. Italian airfields buzzed with urgency as pilots scrambled to defend their homeland. Orders were barked, engines screamed to life, and squadrons lifted into the burning skies. Yet behind every cloud, behind every glint of sunlight, there lingered the shadow of the gull-winged beast. By now, the reputation of the Corsair was legend. Pilots spoke its name with dread. Some called it La Morte Alata, the winged death. Others refused even to speak of it, fearing the very thought would curse their mission. But no superstition, no denial, could erase the truth. The Corsair owned the sky. In one desperate battle above Palermo, a mixed squadron of Macchi C.205s and Fiat G55s took off to intercept American bombers. These were Italy's best machines, the pride of its dwindling arsenal. As they climbed, hope flickered. Perhaps this time they could prove themselves. Perhaps this time they could stand. But hope was a fragile thing. The bombers were not alone. Out of the horizon came the Corsairs, their engines growling like thunder. The Italian leader gave the order to engage, and the sky exploded in violence. From the very first clash, it was chaos. The Corsairs dove with blinding speed, shredding the Italian formation before it could even settle into attack. One Macchi burst into flames, spiraling downward like a comet. Another tried to climb, but a Corsair cut across its path, spitting streams of bullets that ripped it apart in seconds. The Italians fought back fiercely. A Fiat G55 managed to line up behind a Corsair, firing bursts that stitched across its fuselage. For a heartbeat, victory seemed possible. But the American pilot pulled a maneuver no one expected, flipping the heavy fighter into a sudden roll and diving away. Within seconds, he was back on the Fiat's tail. The burst that followed ended the duel, leaving only smoke and wreckage behind. Witnesses on the ground described it as a slaughter. The Corsairs moved with terrifying precision, their wings slicing through the sky like the scythes of death itself. Within minutes, the Italian squadron was broken. Bombers continued unchallenged, their payloads raining down on the city below, while the Corsairs hunted the survivors one by one. For the Italian people watching from rooftops and fields, it was a moment of despair. The defenders they had once admired were now powerless, swatted from the skies by an enemy too strong to resist. Each burning aircraft that fell was not just a loss of metal and flesh, it was the collapse of hope. Back at the bases, the surviving pilots returned in silence. Some refused to remove their helmets, hiding their shame. Others sat on the ground, staring into nothing. One young man, no older than 20, broke down in tears, muttering the same words again and again. "We are already dead." High Command tried to mask the disaster with bravado. They issued reports claiming heavy enemy losses, exaggerating every Italian success. But the truth could not be hidden from those who had fought. The Corsair was not merely another enemy fighter. It was the embodiment of Allied power, a machine that represented the industrial might of America and the unstoppable tide of the war. And as the weeks passed, the nightmare deepened. More Corsairs appeared in the Mediterranean, escorting bombers, sweeping the seas, hunting anything that dared to fly against them. For Italian pilots, every mission became a gamble with death, a roll of dice where the odds were stacked against them. Some tried to adapt. They flew lower, hugging the terrain to avoid detection. Others launched night missions, hoping darkness would shield them. But even then, the Corsair found ways to strike, its pilots relentless, its presence suffocating. Stories spread of Italian aces who refused to take off when Corsairs were reported nearby. Not from cowardice, but from a grim understanding. To face them was suicide. For every Italian pilot lost, replacements grew harder to find. Training schools emptied. Airfields grew quieter. The sky itself seemed to belong to someone else now. And so, as the Allies pushed deeper into Italy, the Corsair became a symbol of inevitability. With each battle, it hammered into the hearts of Axis soldiers the same message: resistance was futile. One Italian officer, watching yet another squadron fail to return, wrote in his diary, "We no longer fight for victory. We fight only for honor, and even that is being stripped away from us." The Corsair has broken not just our planes, but our souls. By late 1943, the Italian surrender became reality. The once proud Regia Aeronautica lay in ruins, its pilots either scattered, captured, or too few to matter. And above the broken nation, the Corsairs still flew, circling like vultures over the carcass of an empire. For the Americans, it was triumph. For the Italians, it was tragedy. But for history, it was a turning point. The moment when the balance of the air war was no longer in question. The Corsair was not invincible. It had flaws. It was difficult to land, heavy on the controls, and demanded skill from its pilots. Yet, in the hands of the Americans, supported by the vast machine of war production, it became a force of nature. A weapon not just of steel, but of fear. And for the Italian pilots who faced it for the first time, it was an experience they would never forget. They had entered the sky as warriors. They returned as survivors of a massacre. The gull-winged beast had announced its arrival with fire and fury. And in doing so, it had written its name into history, forever remembered as the nightmare of the Mediterranean skies.